You're listening to the AmWritingFantasy Podcast. In today's publishing landscape, you can reach fans all over the world. Query letters are a thing of the past. You don't even need a literary agent. There is nothing standing in the way of making a living from writing. Join two best-selling authors who have self-published more than 20 books between them. Now, on to the show with your hosts, Autumn Burt and Jesper Schmidt.
Hello, I'm Jesper, and this is episode 66 of the AmWritingFantasy Podcast. So while Autumn is taking care of some other stuff today, I'm extremely pleased to be joined by probably one of the most influential voices in the indie author space. So I'm going to have a very interesting chat with Joanna Penn. And while we start out by talking about exclusivity versus going wide, I'll also try to ask Joanna some questions that I at least hope she hasn't heard a million times before, but we'll see how that goes. Chances are that you've heard Joanna on other podcasts before, so I want to see if I can take the conversation in a slightly different direction than normal, but we'll see how that goes. For those of you who might not know Joanna, I can let you know that she's an award-nominated New York Times and USA Today best-selling author, and Joanna writes thrillers under JF Penn and have written more than 30 books and sold over 500,000 books in 84 countries, and I think it's probably more than that by now, and 5 languages. So she is a very big advocate of selling your books wide rather than being exclusive to Amazon. And she regularly advises authors on topics within self-publishing through her very successful podcast, the Creative Pen Podcast. So I honestly tried to reduce that introduction as much as I could, Joanna, but there's so much to say, so I didn't know where to stop. But welcome to the AmWritingFantasy Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jesper. And I realised I've been going for more than a decade now in this indie space, so it can be difficult to encapsulate. But I'm really happy to be on the show today and answer any questions you have.
Yeah, that's very good. I don't know, maybe just to start off softly here, is there anything maybe you could share about yourself or what you're doing at the moment that I didn't quite touch upon there in the intro?
Well, I think what's interesting, might be interesting to the listeners. I mean, you have the AmWritingFantasy Podcast. And in fact, I got up this morning and went to my writing cafe and wrote 2,000 words on my next fantasy novel. So
nice.
I am a fantasy writer. I do like fantasy maps as you do. And so I'm writing the third in my Matt Walker trilogy, which is a kind of dark fantasy, split world, portal fantasy, I think sometimes they're called. But then my other self, as Joanna Penn, this week I have a launch for Audio for Authors, which is about podcasting and audiobooks and voice technologies and the AI and voice and that kind of thing. So one of the important parts of me is that I'm quite a split personality, both similar to you. I mean, you do the same thing. You write fiction, non-fiction, and I write in lots of other genres. So I think that's what I'm working on at the moment. Well, what I'm always working on is I'm always trying to balance my fiction and my non-fiction, which is a challenge for many writers.
Oh, yes. I think I'm going to ask you a bit more about that today as well. That balance part, that is difficult. But once again, at least thank you for joining today. And because one of the things that I initially thought about when we wanted to invite you onto the podcast was the whole topic about being wide versus being exclusive to Amazon, meaning publishing within Kindle Unlimited. And I do personally know why you think it's better to be wide, and I agree with your points of view on that. But I think it's sort of a topic that bears repeating, and it's quite important to think about those things when people are publishing, whether or not you want to publish wide or you want to be exclusive to Amazon. But maybe you could just talk us through your line of thinking when it comes to being wide versus being exclusive.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a few things. First of all, there is a choice on every book and every format. So you just mentioned Kindle Unlimited. So that's ebooks specifically within the markets that have Kindle Unlimited, which is a very small part of the world and a very small part of the publishing ecosystem. So even if you want to be on KU for your ebooks, you can still go wide with print and audio, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or you could go exclusive with a series and then go wide with other books, or or in one genre or an author name. So there are so many different variations of what wide and exclusive means. So I want to be clear up front. Second thing is that because I've been publishing independently since before there was even a Kindle, so, when did I start writing? 2006, and I published in 2008. It wasn't till 2010 the International Kindle came along. So I basically started self-publishing when ebooks were just kind of starting out, moving from downloadable PDFs from websites to the e-reader. And there was no Kindle Unlimited till I think it was 2014. Was when it started out. KDP Select started out. So I might be wrong on the dates, but it was certainly a number of years after I started publishing. Also, I'm obviously English, and I was living in Australia at the time. So even when Americans could publish within the KU ecosystem, the Kindle ecosystem, those of us who were international could not. And it's still not open to everyone. So this is the first thing. I mean, there are people listening to this show potentially all over the world. And my podcast has been downloaded in over 220 countries, which I think is pretty much everywhere. So what we've got to remember is when you're on the internet, whether it's podcasting or books or whatever, you have to think that there are people who would like to buy your books all over the world. And as you mentioned, I have in fact now sold books in 134 countries, which is kind of crazy. So this is my perspective as an international author. What I feel is so often the self-publishing community is dominated by American voices, and America is the biggest market for sure on its own. But if you put everything else together, everything else is much, much bigger. And we've barely even begun the digital transformation in most countries. So I have this long-term view. I have this international view. I also have a multifaceted view, I guess, because I have so many books. I know you and Autumn have a lot of books as well. So I do actually have a couple of books in Kindle Unlimited for German. So I have 3 German books. They are in KU because I have no ability really to market in German. And in fact, I just put an audiobook live today in German. Because I have no other way of marketing those, I've decided to use Kindle Unlimited and ACX for Audible specifically in order to use the marketing that I need for a market I have no other way of reaching. Whereas for English language, I have a podcast, I have a website, I use social media. I can reach a market globally through other means. So there is so many things to think about when it comes to exclusivity versus wide. And look, if someone listening, if you're just starting out, if you only have one book and you're putting it out in ebook, then sure, go in KU, not a problem, because there's a lot of things to consider when you are first starting out. And then because it's only a 90-day, turnover, you could change your mind later on and go wide later on. But what I would say is for print is very interesting because KDP print is brilliant. You can sell your book on Amazon stores, but you won't get into libraries, you won't get into bookstores, you won't get into universities. There's a lot of things you can't do if you publish print on Amazon only. So I recommend Ingram Spark for print, and then with KDP print plus Ingram Spark. And then for audio, I use ACX for the Audible market, and then I use Findaway Voices again for library ecosystems and for Google Play, for Scribd, for all those places where people are getting their audio now. So I hope that gives you some sort of facets of the different parts of wide versus exclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a good point buried in there as well, in the sense that it's not a forevermore decision when you decide, for example, if you put a book into Kindle Unlimited, it can be a per book decision as well. It's not like you can just pull it out 3 months later. So maybe there is also a point around not overthinking it in that sense, that if you want to test it out, the waters for a while there, you could do so. But at the same time, wouldn't you also say that those people who read books in subscription systems like Kindle Unlimited are not necessarily kind of the same people who buy books? So if you're building an audience purely, for example, in Kindle Unlimited, and then you pull them wide afterwards, you're starting a bit over in building an audience wide. Wouldn't you say so?
Yes, but then I think as our author career develops, I think we're always building new audiences. So, I know plenty of authors who go into KU for the first year and then take the whole series wide, for example. And this is, someone like Lindsay Broker, who's one of the biggest indie fantasy authors, but she writes a book a month, whereas I write a couple of books a year. In fact, I only write one fantasy book a year. So that's hard to do when you're not someone who puts a lot of books out. But the biggest difference for those of us who do this for a career and a new author is that a new author literally generally has one book, or maybe they have a couple of books if they've held on to some things. So I do recommend that people start with getting to grips with one ecosystem and then moving into other things later for ebooks. But again, I really want to reiterate, especially with nonfiction, you and I both write nonfiction as well. Nonfiction is a very print heavy and very audio heavy market. And in fact, fantasy books, especially if they're long fantasy books, or if you do a fantasy audio book box set, you can get really good sales in audio as well. So what I really want to emphasize is the idea of having multiple formats as well as multiple stores, multiple countries. So if you think about a business plan, that is the kind of scaling that you want to do over time. And as for different kinds of readers, I agree with you. I'm someone who buys books on the Kindle, but what we're seeing with digital, with audio as well as ebooks, is a move to more and more subscription services. So I mentioned Scribd, for example, which is growing fast in audiobooks. Obviously, it's not just Audible, it's Storytel, it's all these different types of subscription services. So I don't think we're stopping the subscription service anytime soon. I think what I want is to say I'd rather be on every subscription service. So I have no issues with KU. I have an issue with exclusivity.
Yeah. I was actually just about to say the same thing. For example, Kobo Plus as well. I don't have any problem with their subscription model there because they don't demand you to be exclusive. That's the part that I also personally don't like. And also Amazon making, well, as authors, our income is the books that we're selling, unless we're doing other things as well. But at least from a starting point, that's the income we're building. And being 100% dependent on Amazon deciding something else tomorrow than they did today, I don't know. It just does not feel good to me.
No, exactly. I'm the same as you know.
Yeah. But maybe that moves us quite nicely into another part of the same conversation, because as authors, of course, we are, as we just said, we are building an income based on book sales. But one thing is that a book can be several different things, like you just talked about. Audiobooks is another format. Maybe there is foreign rights or whatnot, but there's also other things you can do as an author. I mean, of course, both you and myself and Autumn also run some author courses and that sort of thing. So what I'm getting into is sort of multiple streams of income that you can make a living from, rather than being dependent on a single sole income as, for example, ebooks or whatever we want to say. But I was wondering, if we are thinking about somebody who wants to build a full-time income, is it, or maybe there is no difference here, but that's my question, right? Would you recommend that people focus on like a few well-earning streams of income and then put all their, marketing focus and all their money in those baskets? Or is it better to have just a lot of smaller streams of incomes that together builds up a larger streams? And maybe, what are the pros and cons of each, if there are any? That was a long question. Sorry.
Yeah. So, there's a couple of questions to kind of fire at people listening. Yeah. One is, what is a full-time income? So this differs in so many ways. Let's say you're listening and you're single and you're renting and you don't have kids, you don't have a lot of debt. That is a very different situation to someone, who might be in my age, mid 40s, maybe has a mortgage, has some kids in school, the definition, and there's obviously, if you live in New York City versus the middle of, Sheffield here, or places indeed that might be cheaper to live. So that would be one thing, that you have to decide what is a full-time income. That needs to be the number one thing. The second thing needs to be, what do you want to do full-time? So, for example, I mentioned Lindsay Broker. So Lindsay's a friend of mine, and she has obviously the Six Figure Author podcast, which I highly recommend. But Lindsay writes all the time. She has said that she does sometimes 10-hour days writing. Now, there is a different personality type and a different type of author. No one is the same type of author, but when I compare myself to Lindsay, she writes every day for that many hours. So maybe she puts in a 40, 50-hour week on the actual writing. I write, but I generally write maybe 2 hours a day. So maybe I put in a 10-hour week in terms of writing fiction. So if you look at how we make a living, that is going to be reflected in the work that we do and that we want to do. So when as I said, I've been doing this full time for almost 10 years now, since I left my job in 2011. And I have never wanted to make a full-time income from fiction. I wanted to be an author entrepreneur. So this is the thing. Who are you as a personality? I cannot help myself. I don't think you can either. I mean, if you end up going, oh, I really want to write this nonfiction book, or I really want to do this course because I want to help other people, or I really want to podcast because I want to talk about the things I care about. And I think you come from a business background.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So we just can't help ourselves. So there are other people listening who might be like Lindsay, who literally all they want to do is write fantasy books all day. So what you end up with is the desire to do different things also feeds into the multiple stream of income idea. And that's really important because we don't want you to be miserable. You don't want to give up your job and then find you hate it. I would go nuts if I tried to write fiction as a full-time job.
Me too, I think.
Exactly. But that's just not how our brains work. I'm very happy writing a couple of novels a year, a couple of nonfiction, do a course, etc. So that covers the first. So 2 questions. How much do you want to make? What is a full-time living? 2, what kind of person are you and what type of work is going to make you happy? Because at the end of the day, we all have to work. You just have to choose what you want to work at. Okay, so let's get on to the multiple streams. So I have so many, like many hundreds at this point, of streams of income. And there are, as you say, there are 2 kind of basics, active ones and passive ones, and then what kind of half passive. Nothing is truly passive, unfortunately. But if we take, I know you've done a podcast on Scrivener, for example. So I have a tutorial on Scrivener. I have a tutorial on Vellum. Do you use Vellum?
Yeah, Autumn uses Vellum, yeah. Okay,
so Vellum, for anyone listening, is formatting software. I love it. So I have a tutorial on Vellum on my website, thecreativepenn.com, and I have an affiliate link. So an affiliate link is commission. So if somebody uses my link and buys Vellum or buys Scrivener, then I get some money. Now, I recorded that video several years ago. It just sits on my website. People come to the website and I get money every month from those software platforms. Now, it's a useful video. You don't have to buy using my link, and it's kind of evergreen, about as passive as you can get in terms of an income stream. So what is the problem in doing that? You just have to spend a couple of hours making a tutorial video that will help your audience. So that's an idea of passive. I don't believe book sales are passive income because you really have to market these days. You can get some residual sales. So I always say to my husband, if I died, it will probably take 2 years before the sales withered to nothing unless you do some marketing. So books are certainly not passive income. Doing a course, so I know you do courses, I do courses, and I don't launch my courses. They're all evergreen, which means, again, they sit on my website and you can buy them anytime. So again, in a way, they're kind of passive. And then just some ideas about active income streams. So one, obviously, both of us do a podcast, and I have a Patreon. I think, do you have a Patreon?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, I thought you did. So Patreon is an active income stream because if you don't produce a podcast, you will not get any money from your patrons. Thank you, patrons, by the way, everyone listening. You are wonderful. We love you.
Yes. Absolutely.
In fact, I dedicated my latest book, Audio for Authors. It's dedicated to the listeners of my podcast and especially my patrons because
perfect.
Yeah, because they really not make me, but drive me back to the microphone every week.
Yeah.
Okay, so Patreon, and also just for those of you who write, Lindsay, again bringing Lindsay up because she's a fantasy author. I figure, have you had Lindsay on your show?
Yes, we actually did. Yes.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so Lindsay also has a Patreon for her books. So she does something smart. She releases her books to her patrons first and then puts them in KU. So she actually gets around the exclusivity by, giving, basically selling them to her patrons on a pre-release, then putting them in KU. And then when the series is done, she puts it wide. So she's got a really good model there. The other person is she writes as Mirror Grant as well. Anyway, there's a lot of writers who put short stories on Patreon. N.K. Jemisin has a Patreon. I mean, she's won all the Hugo Awards and everything. So Patreon can certainly be used for writing, but again, it's an active income stream. And then another one would be speaking. So if you are a successful author, at some point you will be asked to speak, whether that's at a literary festival, which will not pay you, or they'll just pay expenses, or you could, speak and get paid. You could do your own events, that type of thing. So, and again, that is an active income stream. You have to get people to come along, and then you actually have to teach it. So those are a couple of examples of active and slightly more passive income streams.
Yeah, I want to circle back to the events in just a few minutes, but before going there, the one thing that I'm quite sure many people will be thinking is that, okay, so if we're doing all of these things, because I agree with what you said before, that it all depends also on what do you want to do, and thus if you want to do it, hopefully it doesn't feel like slave work or something like that, then you're happy to do it, right? But at the same time, if we are juggling multiple things here, and I know you do a lot, so my question to you was, how do you structure your workday to make sure that you apply enough focus on the different things? Because as you brought up the example with Lindsay, right? If you're just writing and you're writing 8 hours a day and then you do 1 hour marketing or whatever, then that's pretty simple. But in cases like both us and you, where you're building maybe courses, you are attending all kinds of different stuff, but also you're writing some nonfiction and fiction and whatnot, how do you decide where to focus and put enough energy in each one every day?
Right. Well, I've always done the same. I had a day job, just so everyone knows. I did have a day job for the first 5 years of doing this. So 2006 to 2011, I had a day job. And my schedule then is the same as now. So I do creative work in the mornings, and I do marketing and business in the afternoons. So when I had a day job, I would get up at 5 and I would try and do an hour before then going to my day job. And in the evening, I would come home and work on the podcast, work on my business website. And then at the weekends, I was teaching courses and building out the business. So basically, I did that for 5 years. So when I left my job, I already had streams of income. Now I do pretty much the same thing. It's just I go in the morning to a cafe and I write and I work on first draft material. And I have to get out the house because I'm talking to you at my home office and I cannot write first draft material in this office. So because I'm surrounded by distraction, as you say, I have a lot of other things to do. There's always more email, there's always more stuff to do. But I leave the office and I go and I write. So I know today I did my 2,000 words and that's done. And then I go and do some exercise and then I come back here, and then the afternoon/evening I do interviews, I do podcasting, I do business, accounting, all the things you have to do to run a business. I'll also do course creation and anything kind of more technical in the afternoons. So that is literally it. If you're listening and you're not a morning person, then you're going to have to do it at night. Maybe it's the other way around. Or you could do alternate days. If you literally only have 1 hour, maybe you can alternate the days. Or if you're just starting out, again, finish a book. Like, don't get distracted by marketing and all these other things until you have a book. I get way too many questions from authors who are like, what should I do about marketing? And I'm like, so how many books do you have? They're like, oh, I haven't even finished a first draft. So finish the book first. But that is how I manage my time. Also, another tip is I use Google Calendar to really manage my time in hour blocks, sometimes half-hour blocks, and everything is highly scheduled. So, and when I'm in that time slot, like you and I right now, we have a time slot, we're doing our interview, and then the time slot is done, and I have another time slot after this. I have a whole load of interviews this afternoon. So I batch tasks and basically just focus within the period of time I've allowed, whether or not that's, a half an hour or an hour like I did back in the day, or now my full-time life.
Yeah, I'm wondered, not versus Autumn, for example. Autumn is not maintaining a day job, but I'm still maintaining a day job because I'm kind of in this place where you talked about earlier, right? How much income do you need to replace? And unfortunately, I have too much I need to replace. So I'm still doing the day job. So at least on my end as well. I kind of adopt the same thing as you were saying there, in the means that I can only do my creative stuff, but of course I have to do it very early in the morning before I do my day job activities. But I can only do creative stuff in the morning because I always feel like afternoon, evening, I'm just too tired. So, but I can easily do marketing stuff and all that stuff in the evening because with the business background, that comes easy to me. So I don't need to use too much brain power doing that.
I think, and that's exactly the same as me. It is much easier to do this kind of stuff than it is to write fiction. And actually, what I would say to people, and there's some romantic myth that being a full-time writer is the goal. That's not necessarily the goal. The goal is to have a great life and to write your books as well. If you look at some of the figures that have come out from the various author organizations, most writers, including most indie writers, do not make very much money at all. So you have to either have multiple streams of income or you keep your job. And in fact, I would also say having a job is great. If you enjoy your job, then keep your job. I hated my job, so I really wanted to leave my job. And this is the thing, but I definitely want to encourage people. Look, if you can keep your creative life alongside your day job, then you won't have to do a lot of other things to bring in multi streams of income. You can just focus on your creative work. And in fact, the book Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, she actually says you should support your art. Don't ask your art to support you. And I find that very challenging because, of course, I do have my art, but I also have my business. So these are things that everyone has to weigh up for themselves. But as somebody told me a long time ago, don't be romantic about how you pay your bills. Money is money.
That's a good point for sure. But I wanted to circle back to the events that you mentioned a few moments ago. And I guess this is a bit of a sort of a self-serving question because I feel like, when you get you on the podcast, I'm entitled to at least have one self-serving question as well. Because one of the things that Autumn and I have been discussing was to whether or not we should look at in the future doing some events on our own, putting some together, maybe either with larger audiences or maybe with smaller, intimate audiences. I don't know. But I have all the time been wondering if you're looking at it from an income perspective, if it is really a viable way to get an income, because it feels to me like if you go with the large audience, of course, you're also gonna, you have a lot of work on your hands to organize everything. And of course, you need to be able to attract enough of a crowd to actually fund the venue that you decide to take out. But if you go with a small crowd, then I feel like either you have to have such a high ticket price that people are not really gonna want to do it, or you can only just cover your costs. So I'm just curious a bit about what your experience when it comes to speaking gigs and events and stuff like that. Is it something that is viable to look at as something you can earn money from, or is it more like building your brand name kind of thing?
Well, again, it depends on what type of speaking you're going to do. And because there are all kinds, I have a friend who is a keynote speaker for places like Google and Facebook. And, he can get 20 grand for a lunch meeting. Right. So if you choose to speak to a corporate audience and you have a topic that is appropriate for corporate events, then you can earn tons. But if you are, let's say you're going to do a workshop on fantasy map making, then you are not going to make much money from that because the audience won't pay for that workshop, they're not going to pay that much for that workshop. So this is where you have to decide your own goal. And whereas, for example, you could decide to speak at an author convention, you could do a panel on an author convention, and that would help build your brand. As you say, will probably sell some of your fantasy map making books, may get you some more readers, but you don't do author events for the money because it's just not there, as you say. So in terms of actual income, and I may be running, as we speak, the coronavirus thing is having fun with the world. Yes. So I was about to actually book a hotel for a in-person event, and I was going to have 30 people. I may still do this, so by the time anyone listens to this, it may well be happening or might be in the future or whatever. But the types of things I've done where I have made money, and when I say made money, I mean a couple of £1,000 in a weekend, which, to many people is good money. And also it's can be an interesting weekend. So that would be 30 people in a decent hotel, and the price would be aimed at people who are serious about their writing career. So it's not a 101 how to write a book type of situation. So you've got a number of factors there. It's, what are you comfortable doing? And I've been doing professional speaking again for a decade. So I know how to run a small event like that. I would never, ever run a big event. I think the risk is too high. And also it's not fun for me. I'm an introvert, I don't enjoy big events anyway. So you have to decide, like, who are you, who are the audience, who's going to pay. And so, for example, I've had an idea on the back burner for a few years now that I'll write and probably pitch to a traditional publisher in order to aim for that corporate speaking market. I may well still do that as well, but that's where I see if you want to be a speaker, then you can earn money with the right audience. If you want to be a teacher and run small events and or speak at author things, then it is a much smaller thing. And speaking at fantasy conventions, that is a brand building. So there's just such a range of things.
I see what you're saying. And I think also, of course, for the corporate speaking market, I fully agree with that. Of course, from our point of view, we were more looking at the the author community, right? Because our courses are aimed at authors and all that. So that would be our audience, right? Other authors wanting to go to an event, whatever that may be.
Yeah,
right?
and then you have to look at the author market in general and say, there are some authors with some money, but if you look at the ticket price on most author events, they are not very high. So yes, there are ways you can do it, but you have to know your audience and know your value to the audience and what you can deliver that is worth a higher ticket price, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something we will continue discussing internally, myself and Autumn, about what we want to do there. But for one, I think it could be fun. Of course, running a podcast, running courses, we also do all of that stuff because we like helping other people. We like teaching, right? So
exactly, and that's another reason to do it. But you asked about the money.
Yeah, indeed. Because basically, I guess what we're trying to see if there is like a overlap in the Venn diagram here, right? Where it's not because we need to get rich from it, but we do want to earn a bit of money, because at the end of the day, preparing an event, but also going to an event, it is taking away time from other things that we could be doing that would earn us money. So it needs to sort of be justified in that sense as well. That's something we'll think about. But
I think you should probably start, the pair of you or one of you, whoever, you should pitch for panels at existing events or pitch to do workshops at existing events, and then see if you enjoy it, basically.
Yeah, Autumn has already participated in a couple of different panels in the US where she's based. So she already sort of dipped her toes into the pond there. So, okay, but that's good. But that was a bit about future thinking here. So maybe I could shift us into another future question here, Joanna, because I know that you probably, unlike most others, I guess, really like to look into the futuristic stuff. So when I had you on here, I couldn't think of anyone better to ask about where you see stuff like VR and augmented reality come into fiction books, and if this is something we should, as authors, actually pay some attention to. And if we want to pay attention to it, where do we look? Where do we get those if we want to get in early on some of the stuff, where do we get the inputs and the insights as to how to do stuff like that?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, augmented reality and virtual reality are really starting to take off. And in fact, again, circling back to the coronavirus, what we're seeing is share prices in companies that do remote working and remote experiences are going up. So I think we may even see an acceleration in things like AR and VR because of this virus issue, because people will want to do more in VR. So, for example, I'm meant to be speaking, when this goes out, it will have happened or not happened, but I don't know right now whether London Book Fair is going ahead. And I'm meant to be speaking at an event, and if I could speak in virtual reality, then I probably would. So in talking about teaching courses, for example, I do think that we're going to see the rise in, there's a lot of digital tickets to events at the moment you can get, to conventions and stuff, that in the future maybe we just deliver those in VR, or in terms of marketing, maybe you and I meet in some kind of virtual space, and people can attend the virtual space. So I think there'll be a lot of teaching, a lot of events will happen in VR. Of course, one of the biggest areas that's already ahead of the curve is gaming. So a good example in the fantasy space, of course, is The Witcher. Have you read the books or seen the...
I've seen the movie or series,
Netflix.
I should say.
Yeah, well, of course,
Netflix.
The books have become massive because of the gaming. So what I think is interesting is the licensing of fantasy universes for gaming, and that is a challenge for independents. I do not think AR and VR are things we can do alone. So whereas we can very easily write a book alone, format it with Vellum, and pay a cover designer and an editor, please, but we can basically get books out on our own. I have my own audio booth. I can do audiobooks on my own. But when it comes to AR, VR, gaming, adaptation of fantasy worlds into this multimedia space, this is where licensing is going to come into its own. So I really think this is a fascinating area, and there's going to be lots more stuff going on. And I know quite a lot of writers who write for gaming worlds at the moment. That's definitely something that fantasy authors can consider if they want to look at that. That's obviously work for hire, which we didn't talk about, but that is, that's a sort of contract jobs. But yeah, books to gaming, to adaptation, to fantasy worlds that are turned into these entertainment experiences, that is only going to get bigger as we get more and more of these streaming services, Disney and Amazon and Netflix and everybody else. So I think that's very exciting. But as I said, the education side, that's probably where I'll be looking over certainly in the next decade. By the time we get to 2030, I think we'll be doing things quite differently. In terms of podcasting, in terms of marketing, there'll be a lot more that is online in real life, if you get what I mean, sort of in that way.
Do you think fiction books, for example, Kindle or ebooks, do you think that they will become more interactive in one way or another?
No, I think it is the interactivity of an ebook to me is has to be another product. I think we might, the formats. So audiobooks, for example, I'm thinking of adapting some of my audiobooks. And an audiobook is a straight read of a text, right? But I could rewrite my books as audio dramas. So I've written quite a lot of screenplays for my books, but audio dramas are cheaper to produce. So I'm definitely thinking of that. But in terms of the interactivity, people get that from gaming. People get that from other formats of a work. So I do think that the ebook is not something that will become interactive. I think it'll just be something different. So it might be an augmented reality experience, whatever you call that. So, for example, I've written some crime books that are set along the South Bank of London. And I've thought about, well, maybe I could do an augmented reality tour of that area of London. So if you walk around there, I'll be there next to you talking about the place. I have thought about that. But again, I think we have to consider these things as different formats, and also going beyond being independent to licensing. So we haven't really talked about licensing at all, but we have copyright in our creative work, and we can license it to different people to do different things. So I think indies have mastered doing things ourselves, the basic stuff, but we're going to have to get a lot more comfortable with licensing if we want to move into these more extended worlds.
Right. And do you think... all this VR, augmented reality and stuff. Do you think that this is something that would be good to get going early, or getting as an early adopter of that? Or is it better to wait until it becomes a bit more mainstream and maybe the cost goes down to produce it and stuff like that?
I don't think you can get into this early as an independent. I can't see how you can. It's not like you can buy a piece of software like Vellum and then make something, unless you're a programmer. Getting involved with that, to me, as a creative, I can't see a way to get involved in it early.
No, I agree. Let me clarify what I meant. What I meant was more to really pay a lot of focus on what is happening in the market and sort of have your finger on the pulse. And then if a company comes out with some sort of solution that can be used from an author perspective, then you jump in really early and start moving on it. Or is it better to sort of wait? Because what I'm thinking is that if you jump in early, the cost will also be significantly higher. Whereas if you wait until it's like a proven product that people know that this stuff is working, then probably the cost will go down. But of course, then everybody is doing it and you're not getting the early mover advantage there. So that was more my question. I think I didn't explain it well enough.
Well, I think everyone has to decide what they're interested in. So, I've been podcasting since 2009. So I was clearly into podcasting before it went mainstream. Thus, I was able to take advantage of being an early mover in the space. But I'm not a gamer. So I don't have any gaming headset. If you are a gamer listening, you probably have, you might already have an AR headset. There are lots of different, they've been going, the virtual reality headsets have been going for years now. So I think people will you have to choose what you're interested in and follow that. And it will likely be the stuff you already do for fun. So for me, it's always been audio. For other people, it might be gaming.
Okay, fair enough. All right, well, time flies when you're having fun here. So maybe to finish off, is there a place where you want to direct the listeners to if they want to know more about you and what you're doing, Joanna?
Yes, if you like podcasting, which presumably you do. So come on over to the Creative Penn podcast, Penn with a double N. That is my podcast for authors. I have another podcast called Books and Travel, which is obviously about books and travel. And that is the Books and Travel podcast. And yeah, basically, I think if people have questions, probably the best place is Twitter at The Creative Penn. But it's definitely a really interesting time to be a writer, and being a fantasy writer in particular is definitely a great time to write fantasy. So I appreciate what you and Autumn are doing with this show.
Oh, thank you. And thank you very much for coming on today, Joanna.
No worries. Thanks so much, Jesper.
All right, so I hope you got a lot out of that conversation with Joanna Penn. And next week, Autumn will be back, and we will be back into our old groove again.
If you like what you just heard, there's a few things you can do to support the AmWritingFantasy Podcast. Please tell a fellow author about the show and visit us at Apple Podcast and leave a rating and review. You can also join Autumn and Jesper on patreon.com/AmWritingFantasy. For as little as $1 a month, you'll get awesome rewards and keep the AmWritingFantasy Podcast going. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.